This is a production of Cornell University.
It is my tremendous pleasure to introduce Dr. Niles Eldredge, who is a curator of fossil invertebrates at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Niles is perhaps one of the best-known evolutionary biologists and the author of a remarkable assortment of books for adults and children, scientists, students, and the general public. And the subjects range from his specialty, trilobites, to patterns of extinction, from evolution and to biodiversity. He has degrees from Columbia University in 1965 and 1969. He received his PhD under Norman Newell, correct, from the American Museum, in a Columbia University American Museum graduate student program, and right after that he started working at the American Museum of Natural History. So he's never worked anyplace else. You can't do that anymore, but that's wonderful. His specialty is the evolution of mid-Paleozoic Phacopeda trilobites. There's actually a trilobite genus named after you, isn't there?
Yeah, it actually should be synonymized.
Okay, he doesn't like this. But the very well-known Phacops that we all know as Phacops is now Eldridgeops, is it? Or he doesn't like that. But it is singular that it has been named for him, whether it holds up or not. It's fun. It's fun. So, he's very well known for one thing in particular, and that is his theory of punctuated equilibrium in 1972 with Stephen Jay Gould. That's the theory, as I'm sure most of you know, that evolution occurs in dramatic spurts interspersed with long periods of stasis or stability. When I first began I worked for the American Museum of Natural History myself for almost 10 years, and my first year in 1997, Niles was one of the 3 curators renovating the Hall of Biodiversity, so my introduction to Niles was in that context. Niles is an authority on Charles Darwin, and in 2005 he was the curator of the museum's incredibly successful exhibition on Darwin, which is now still traveling. How many versions of it are traveling? How many copies of it?
Now and a couple more coming.
Oh boy, so it's everywhere all the time, and it's wonderful.
Bifurcating species.
But if you haven't seen it, it's really a remarkable exhibit. I went on Amazon just to check for Niles's books, because I know he's written a lot of books. We have one for sale up in the bookstore if you're interested in buying one to get him to sign. That's always fun. I don't remember the time I ever Googled somebody I actually knew that had 6 pages of books on Amazon. More than 30 titles, including Darwin, Discovering the Tree of Life, Reinventing Darwin, The Great Debate at the High Table of Evolutionary Theory, Life on Earth, an Encyclopedia of Biodiversity, Ecology, and Evolution, and this is a fun one, The Fossil Factory, A Kid's Guide to Digging Up Dinosaurs, Exploring Evolution, and Finding Fossils. One of his latest ventures has been a new journal. It's called Evolution, Education, and Outreach, which is right up our alley here at PRI and Museum of the Earth. So we're very interested in this and watching it, and I understand 2 issues are already out.
Third one is just about coming, and it's free online.
And it's free online, so check it out. Google it. It looks very, very interesting. Another very interesting part of Niles is that he plays jazz trumpet, and is an avid collector of 19th century cornets. He has more than 500 in his collection, reportedly. One of my fondest memories at AMNH is on the day before Christmas break or holiday break, sitting in my office late in the day and suddenly hearing Christmas carols being played in the hallway. And Niles was out there with his horn. It was great. So today he's going to be talking to us about Darwin, paleontology, and evolution, the Beagle years and the aftermath. So please welcome him.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Warren. Thank all of you. This is actually a great pleasure to be up here. I'm honored that you've asked me to come. It's great to be back in the Devonian, back down in New York. We're on crystalline rocks and don't see much of this stuff unless we come up. The first slide, is that the black? That's the black one, huh? So, yeah. That's the title. What better place to come and talk about the impact that fossils, paleontology, but fossils, had on the young Darwin when he was on the Beagle. When we did the Darwin show, I felt sort of humbled by that because I'm not a historian or a paleontologist. And in a sense, I've been fighting some of Darwin's legacy all along in evolutionary theory, try to tweak it and try to make the fossil record give up some of its truths and the way I look at it, and tweak evolutionary theory to have a better, use the fossil record to have a better theory of evolution and understanding of the history of life. And, but I always respected Darwin, basically loved him, and, but I was a little nervous about getting involved with the project. And I looked into it, I read his notebooks when he got home from the Beagle, but on the Beagle years, I just looked into the top surface. And I brought David Cohn, who's a very great historian of Darwin, into the project just to shore things up and really help legitimize and basically help dictate where the project would go. And at the end of doing the Darwin exhibition, we actually left and we went to a Darwin Day in Milan, which was a lot of fun. And then we went to Cambridge for 2 weeks and read in the rare book room Darwin's geology notes, which are largely unpublished from the Beagle. Because I had made a bet with David. I said, I saw this kid with smoking a cigar. I had no idea if he smoked cigars or not. With his foot, 1 foot up on the prow of the Beagle, finally headed back to England after 5 years out there, knowing that he had this earth-shattering theory that he felt that he could demonstrate the truth of, evolution, by the time he got back. And he wrote in his autobiography that he was anxious to take his place amongst the men of science. So I felt that he came back to England sort of very excited and loaded for bear, and specifically, you know, was thinking in explicitly evolutionary terms. And David said, well, you might be right, and people debate this, and there is evidence, I'll show you what it is, that towards the very end of the Beagle journey, he was in fact a committed evolutionist. So we basically knew that that was right. But the question was, when on the Beagle journey did he really start dealing with evolutionary thinking? And so Cohn says, put your money where your mouth is, and let's go to the library and let's see. So I'm going to show you what we found. And I think we found some remarkable things, and not least was Darwin's reliance on, or what the fossils actually did for Darwin in the development of these particular ideas. So let's go to the next slide. This is the earliest image of Charles Darwin. Of course, I'm going to do the Beagle, but we have to sort of consider what he had been through intellectually just briefly before he gets to the Beagle. I think he's 9 years old here. He's holding a plant. So he always loved nature. That's with his younger sister. His mom had already died. He was raised by 3 older sisters. He had an older brother and a pleasant but rather remote father who was a physician, Robert. And but Robert was his father was an avid gardener, so he had Darwin counting up peony flowerings and so forth, and keeping statistics. And he's famous for having said to his son, "You'll never amount to anything. All you think of is shooting dogs and rat catching, and you shall be a disgrace to yourself and to your entire family," something like that. He despaired because the kid was all the time outdoors and hunting birds and collecting rocks and doing all these things that little boys, even back then, were doing. And particularly, the next slide, please, beetles. And this was actually done when he was in his teens. A friend did this really rather nice cartoon saying, "Go it, Charlie," and he's riding his hobby horse, which is beetles. So he's riding an enormous beetle there. And we were lucky enough to get the original of that for the exhibition. And there was a Beetle craze, just like there was a saxophone craze in the United States in the 1920s. Well, in the 18-teens and 1820s in England, there was a Beetle craze. And it wasn't just little boys, it was everybody. It was out, not everybody, but a healthy proportion of the populace was out collecting beetles. And there were beetle societies and so forth. And Darwin found out a little bit about the distribution of animals just from that, because not every beetle species is equally represented all over the countryside in Great Britain, as you can imagine, because that's the nature of things and the nature of distribution of species. So he's very much a naturalist. Okay, he's 16. His father says, I can't stand it. You're going to go to medical school. Sends him up to Edinburgh, and that would be the next slide. Well, first of all, his grandfather. All right, so he had 2 grandfathers, very important. One was Josiah Wedgwood, who founded the Pottery Works. I didn't bring an image of him. I'm trying to keep myself on track, so I didn't bring too many slides. But he was, a mover and shaker in the Industrial Revolution and respected science. So he had that as a background. The other grandfather was Erasmus Darwin, who was also a physician, very well-to-do person, a pal of Josiah Wedgwood, and also an intellectual. And he wrote this book, Zoonomia. And I think the next, that's the title page from, I guess, our copy of Zoonomia. I haven't read this, frankly, exhaustively, but there's passages in there which are quite evolutionary. They are downright evolutionary. And that was very rare for those times. We're talking about the latter part of the 18th century, particularly in England. It was more common in France and other places on the continent for people to entertain evolutionary ideas, but not in England particularly. So actually, he was probably the best known person to have espoused in public evolutionary views was his grandfather. And I think that this is sort of an underappreciated fact. All right, so he gets shipped to medical school, which will be the next slide. That's not the medical school, but that's the guy he meets there, Robert Grant, who is only a few years old. He's probably in his early, well, not there, but when Darwin met him, in his early 20s, I think. But he was a invertebrate zoologist who plied the shores of the Firth of Forth collecting marine invertebrates. And he was an evolutionist. And he was very excited to have met this young person who was the grandson of the only English person who really came out and said that he believed in evolution as well. And this was basically his first formal experience as a scientist. No fossils yet. We're talking about marine invertebrate zoology. But Robert Grant was a devotee of Lamarck, who I think is depicted in the next slide. And as I say, as a committed evolutionist, his invertebrate zoology, he was very interested in bryozoans. And what bryozoans, moss animals, that sort of bespeaks the feeling that these things were sort of plant-like as well as animal-like. And maybe they held the secrets of the divergence between plants and animals. Sort of an evolutionary hangover into the modern biota. So they were studying these things intensively and actually got close to actually writing a paper. And I think Darwin felt eventually that Grant had actually used some of Darwin's own observations and research in a published paper, and it led to a bit of a falling out. But this is a very significant kind of an early experience. He hated medical school. He hated the screams of the patients and the sight of blood, and he just wanted to be outdoors. This was a perfect thing for him to be going up and down the shore with Robert Grant. Now, let me just say about Darwin, I respect him enormously, not least for the fact that I think he's a very honest person. And he's pretty good, I think, trustworthy reporter of his own feelings and what he's actually done. I mean, he has motives for writing things. You're never supposed to really trust what people say they did because you need independent evidence. At the very least, you need to corroborate what it is. But it seems to me that he really tried to be open and honest about this. And in his autobiography, he says amazing things about what it was like to be a kid growing up and all this sort of thing. And he tells an anecdote in there of one day walking along the shores of the Firth of Forth with Robert Grant. And Robert Grant bursts into a sort of all of a sudden he just starts talking about the glories of Lamarck's theories and Darwin's grandfather and how evolution is basically true, and it explains the diversity of life on the planet, and apparently was quite passionate. So the next slide, this is a direct quote from the autobiography. If you don't mind, I'm going to read it out to you. I listened in silent astonishment and as far as I can judge, without any effect on my mind. He's listening to this tirade. I had previously read the Zoonomia of my grandfather in which similar views are maintained, but without producing any effect on me. See, that's like a sort of a, what do you call it? He's a litany. I mean, he keeps repeating himself. Without any effect on me, without any effect on me. Nevertheless, and so people mostly just quote those first two sentences. But then he goes on, and he's truthful, and he says, nevertheless, it is probable that the hearing rather early in life such views maintained and praised may have favored my upholding them under a different form in my Origin of Species. And I think that's very honest of him. And you know that must have had an effect on him, even though he denies it in the first two sentences of there has no effect on my mind. Of course it had a huge effect on his mind. And of course it was his grandfather, but also this person who was first showing him how to do scientific research as well. So he wants to maintain his originality, and I think we'll see by the end of the talk that he's no Lamarckian. He comes at evolution very differently from Lamarck, and his earliest evolutionary theory, as he formulates it on the Beagle, is basically not at all Lamarckian. There's a real distinction, and we'll get into that, and that's because he was dealing with a fossil record. So I think that that's true too, and he had a right to say that he upheld them under a different form in My Origin of Species. But I think, this aspect of Darwin's upbringing is not really well understood. And, we'll keep going on. He was there, I think, for a year and a half in medical school, and he basically flunked out. And his father said, well, you're just wasting my money, but you still need a profession. He also has a line in his autobiography, though, that says that I came to understand whilst I was in Edinburgh, anyway, paraphrasing it, that my father would be leaving me sufficient money that I would not have to get a profession. So I think what he saw for himself was a life of study and quiet, and maybe it was not even sort of really understood, but he was already becoming a naturalist, basically. But his father said, none of that, you've got to have a profession, and they agreed that he should become a clergyman in the Church of England. And I think Darwin probably agreed with that simply because he knew that apart from Sundays, he'd have the rest of the week off, and he could collect all the beetles that he wanted. There's no real testimony to that effect. I mean, I don't really know if he actually literally felt that way. But he agreed with his father, and so off he went to Cambridge, which was the standard way. I have to say his mom, who did die when he was 8, was a Wedgwood, and the Wedgwoods were Unitarians and very liberal in their political views, which was important also to understand what Darwin did down the line when he was vis-a-vis slavery in Brazil and things like this. They were not, so the C of E side of the family, the father's side, was not particularly religious, certainly not his grandfather Erasmus, or even his father Robert, but the sisters, I guess, kind of were. Anyway, it was okay for Darwin. For whatever reasons, he didn't see this as a problem. So he goes off to Cambridge in 27, and he was born in 1809. And so he's, I guess, 18 years old when he goes to Cambridge. And can we have the next slide? This is very important, equally important. Here we are in Cambridge, and there were two people, Adam Sedgwick, probably not the more important of the two in formulating young Darwin's experiences and sort of laying out this sort of mold that he was actually going to fill as he goes on. But Sedgwick was already a very important geologist, as we know, and he was the guy who named the Cambrian system and so on and so forth. But he was already a mover and shaker in the Geological Society of London. I think he became president in 1831. I can't even remember, really. Adam Sedgwick. Very strict man. He was also the proctor, much feared by the students at Cambridge. And he was a reverend. And all faculty members at Cambridge at that time had to be ordained clergymen in the Church of England. So he was a creationist. In fact, years later, in 1859, when Darwin finally got himself to publish On the Origin of Species, the most vitriolic review, at least the one that I think is the most vitriolic, was from Adam Sedgwick, who says, you have taken God out of science and just gone far too far. So Sedgwick had entertained those views back then, but he also was a great geologist. And I'll mention him once. Well, I'll just tell you that just before Darwin got invited to go on the Beagle in August of 1831. He was out in the field at the behest of this next gentleman, the Reverend John Stevens Henslow. He told Sedgwick he should take Darwin out into the field and teach him the rudiments of field geology, which is really one of the most important things that ever happened to Darwin. He learned them in a week and a half, But he got very enthused, and in the months between August and December, when the Beagle finally sailed, Darwin had some fancy, what we would call like the forerunner of a Brunton compass, and he would rearrange the furniture in his rooms and measure all sorts of angles of inclination and so forth. He really took the lessons to heart. Henslow had been a crystallographer, and in the late 1820s got interested in botany, founded the Cambridge Botanical Garden, which still exists, and the herbarium there. And he started teaching a botany course. And I haven't had a chance to really read the syllabus yet, but it does exist. And Darwin took it the first 3 years that it was given, and he started bringing other people in. And Darwin got to be known as the man who walks with Henslow. And they would stride around and just talk about scientific, well, God knows what they were talking about, so to speak. But anyway, presumably an awful lot of botany. And it's quite clear that what he got from Henslow was two things. One was a practical thing. It was about the importance of keeping accurate notes when you're in the field making collections. And then coming back and mounting the specimens properly, writing out their identification, and particularly the geographic locale in which the specimens were collected in. So this became an integral part of Darwin's approach to the natural world in sort of an analytic, sort of proto-scientific manner. The other thing that Henslow noticed was that plants species vary. They vary locally, but particularly they vary geographically. And so he was always interested. In fact, the earliest specimen that Darwin ever collected that anybody knows about now is in the herbarium, and he collected it on the way home from his field trip with Sedgwick in Wales. They went to Wales, and Darwin had grown up in Shropshire near the Welsh border. And someplace, I can't even remember where it is, I think back inside England proper, Darwin collected a plant because he felt it was different from the ones around Cambridge. Same species, but it was a variety. So he was interested in and certainly cognizant of variation, and as I say, also was a good pupil and learned to take very accurate notes and also to take care of his specimens and make sure that they were accurately identified and then finally properly ensconced into a collection. So these guys were creationists, Sedgwick and Henslow. So Whewell was there, who was a philosopher of science. John Herschel was there at Cambridge. And he knew these people and had dinner with them all the time. And these were some of the leading lights in the early side of science. And of course, it's obvious from what I've said, but I'll just say it just the other way around. Robert Grant was unusual because he was one of the earliest that I've heard of professional scientists. I mean, we're professional scientists. We get paid to do this, which is really kind of great. And but otherwise, it was, back then, it was landed gentry, it was people of means and clergy people who were basically the scientists of the day. And there was an overlap there at the universities because some of them were getting paid, but they also were expected to be, in this instance, also clergymen, and active clergymen with a flock, that they would tend on Sundays and so forth. So he was, all right, so there was no professional class, really, that was well-peopled, at least in England, of professional scientists, that it was just beginning to start. And as I say, Robert Grant is one of the earliest examples of that I know of. Okay, the next slide, we're finally, all right, so I'm just summarizing this. He knew of transmutation. There's no way he didn't know, and he tells us, of course, about this, Robert Grant just going off on him about this and just sort of, as we would say, putting it into his face back then. But he was also, of course, familiar with the prevailing idea, which was that basically species were created by by God. That was it. And people would hedge the question. They would not discuss it. It's quite clear now, Martin Rudwick is very good on this, the great geology historian, that the scientists back then, by the 1820s and 1830s in England, certainly in the 1830s, but even in the 1820s, they realized that their job was to find physical causes, secondary causes, natural causes of natural phenomena, no matter how much God might be underlying the system in general. But science's job was to look at the physical reality of the world and discuss things in physical terms. That's what Newton did, who was deeply religious. And Newton did not feel that his work was in any way calling into question the existence of God. He was talking about the secondary, what they called the secondary causes. And people were shying away, though, from the need to explain the origin of species. And it was just like a big black box. And they wouldn't even talk about it. You look at, you read the stuff from the 1820s and the 1830s, and it's so, I'll show you some. It's so evolutionary, you can't believe it, and yet it's not. It's sort of like a proto-evolutionary thing, and it's not really that. But they had, meanwhile, they had basically figured the whole system out without going the whole way. So he's aware of these two possibilities. And as he says later, and I'll show it to you, is it secondary causes or is it direct creation by God? And there are these two possibilities. And I think he was well aware that there were these two possibilities when he left, but he was a creationist, undoubtedly, when he left. So as I say that, I kind of think of this as he's got two decks of cards. And one of them he's taught to basically deal out all the time. It's a creationist deck. And the other deck, though, is this transmutationist deck, which he's got in his back pocket. And the question is, when does he take it out and start fiddling with that deck of cards? And that's, I guess, really what I'm on about here. Next slide. The Beagle was supposed to go for 3 years. It was the purpose of it was funded by the Admiralty. Darwin went as the captain's companion and as the ship's naturalist, but he was unpaid, so his father had to pay for it. His father was violently against him going, and he said, you know, they've picked the bottom of the barrel. It's going to be dangerous. You're going to spend too much money on all this stuff. And finally, his uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, interceded and got him to go. So Fitzroy said, fine, your job will be not only my companion, but I want you to be on shore a lot, which was good because Darwin was seasick a lot of the time. And there was a hope that he would find economically valuable mineral deposits. It's about the one thing that Darwin failed to do on this trip. He did almost everything else. In fact, he was amazing. That's a point I was going to mention later, but I'll mention it now, where he was able to look at whatever presented itself. He got to a place, Maldonado in Uruguay, a couple of years into the trip, and the geology was terrible and it was raining all the time. So he sent his team out to shoot birds. And that became the basis of a lot of his comparative work with bird variation down the length of the southern half of South America, because he never wasted his time. He was sick sometimes, but he never deliberately, he always looked for something to do. If the geology was poor or was all crystalline rocks around Rio, which he felt had already been adequately studied, then he looked at other things. And there was always something for him to do there. The purpose of the journey was to make detailed navigational maps of the southern half of South America on both coasts, because England had, they had taken what they renamed the Malvinas, they renamed them the Falkland Islands in 1828. They were already in Australia, already in South Africa. So they were looking for sort of control, economic and military control of the South Seas. And this was an information gathering voyage, but it had these economic and military implications to it. And it was supposed to go around the world, but it was supposed to take only 3 years, and it ended up taking 5 years. I know that's kind of an obscure map, but anyway, that's most of the time was spent, I won't even bother walking over there, down off the coast of Patagonia, and down, they went to Tierra del Fuego several times. They went to the Falkland Islands a couple of times, and then they finally, in late 1834, went through the Magellan Straits, and then they went up the Chilean and Peruvian coast, and then eventually that famous stop that they made in the Galapagos Islands. Okay, next slide. All right. I think that we should not just take as true what somebody, even with somebody with such integrity as Charles Darwin, and just believe what he says he did and why he did it and so on and so forth, what his motives are and what he thought that he had accomplished and so forth. But we can use this basically as a testable hypothesis. And this is the first sentence or two sentences of The Origin of Species, 1859. During the voyage of the Beagle, I had been deeply impressed by discovering in the Pompeian Formation great fossil animals covered with armor like that of the existing armadillos. Secondly, by the manner in which closely allied animals replace one another in proceeding southwards over the continent. And thirdly, by the South American character of most of the productions of the Galapagos archipelago, and more especially by the manner in which they differ slightly on each island of the group, none of the islands appearing to be very old geologically. Okay, so we could test that. We could turn to his notes. It's like going to the videotape of last night's baseball game, you know, and we could go to his geology notes and see what he actually did. If you read his diary, it's skimpy on science. You have to read his scientific notes, and the zoology notes have been published, and his summary zoology notes, the ornithological notes and animal notes and so forth, have been published. Well, most of them have been published. But not his geology notes, oddly enough, which is mostly about porphyry and stuff. So you have to sort of slog through a lot of, from our perspective. But there are some real gems there. So let's go to that videotape. That's actually a portion of his actual handwriting in the geology notes. I have it there to show that we actually read the actual notes. And David Cohn very, very patiently taught me how to read his handwriting. It's not as bad as it actually looks. And can you see there, to what a remote age, you can actually see that towards it's the last third of that written thing, and it transcribes as, to what a remote age does this in all probability call us back, and yet we find the shells themselves and their habits the same as exist in the present sea. This is his very first stop on the Beagle. They could not go to Tenerife. Can we go to the next slide, just because okay, thanks. That's sort of the punchline of this. They're in Santiago, in the Canary, no, in the, what's the other islands? Anyway, Canary Island group. They couldn't land at Tenerife because there was an outbreak of cholera. So the captain was very impatient to get to South America, so he hauls anchor. And Darwin was really disappointed because he wanted to see tropical vegetation for the first time in his life, and basically didn't. So they get to Santiago, which is kind of bare and barren and so forth. But that quote pertains to what he was walking along the shoreline, and there was an outcrop of limestone capped by a volcanic flow cropping out along the beach. He collected the corals and the mollusks from that, and he looked at the cast-up shells of the invertebrates along the shore, and that's what he was saying. Let's just go back to that. I jumped too soon. His conclusion was that these things are the same, these species are the same in the rocks as they are on the shore. And yet, it's well indurated rock and it's cast up. So to what a remote age does this in all probability call us back? So this has got to be old. And yet we find the shells themselves and their habits the same as exist in the present sea. So he was really making a geological point. It's old, but it ain't that old. But I think that's really remarkable, and that's what I say in the next slide, and go back to that he was lucky on this trip, that for the most part he was confronted with a fossil record that was very recent, and some of the species in it were still alive. And I have to tell you also that as an invertebrate paleontologist, it's a little disappointing and hard to understand given his background with Robert Grant, that he doesn't use marine invertebrates, either fossil or recent ones, all that much in his development of his thinking while he's on the Beagle. But the reason is, it's a biogeographic reason, because he doesn't know what these clams and snails and corals are. He doesn't know their geographic ranges and distributions, and so he can't really understand, he can't be sure that he's dealing with fossilized remains unless they're identical like that, and what their relationship is with a modern biota too much. Is that clear? I mean, yeah. It's hard with these invertebrates. They got long range, and they hadn't been all that well studied. So the next slide. He gets to Bahia Blanca. We're going to go in a couple of months' time. I'm really looking forward to this. In the fall of 1832. And he sees these, well, here's this quote here. And you'll remember what he said in the outset of On the Origin of Species. He says, of the osseous polygonal plates, this is a letter he wrote to Henslow. Immediately I saw them, so this is October of 1832, letter to Henslow. Immediately I saw them, I thought they must belong to an enormous armadillo, living species of which genus are so abundant here. There's actually 9 species of armadillo, 3 genera, in South America, one of which gets up into North America. But he was seeing the fragments and sections of these osseous polygonal plates in the carapace of a glyptodon, and collecting them. And he instantly says, they're the same thing, basically, or they belong to the same group as the armadillos. And there were, I think, two or three species running around Bahia Blanca at the time. So they were on top of the outcrop as living things, and then he's got this stuff down there, and he's starting to say, aha. The thing that I really, and he's not unique here, but his focus is on so-called allied forms. We're going to see, I might as well tell you right now, that other theories of replacement, like Lyell's, were basically ecological theories of replacement. You know, Lyell would say you can't create a a predator species unless you already have a prey species in place. And so he was thinking ecologically. I think Lyle was a brilliant ecologist, but he was actually an anti-evolutionist, and we'll see that in just a moment. So he's already seeing that there are things that seem to be unique. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, this is a taxonomy. Another thing, we had it on display. I have this here because it's a fossil. It doesn't really figure into his thinking that much. It's about 2.5 feet long. It survived the London Blitz, this particular specimen. He bought it for 18 pence from some kids in a hacienda in Patagonia. And they had this thing up against a fence and had been throwing rocks at it and knocked all its teeth out. This fossil has had a checker. I just threw it in because it's a fossil. It's a great fossil, but it doesn't really figure in the next slide. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but let me just say about allied forms. I mean, Lamarck talked about them, but all the way back to Linnaeus. People had this concept of natural groups. They were not an evolutionary concept. But Darwin looked from the get-go. He was insistent. The things that attracted his attention were patterns of replacement in time as well as space of things that seemed to belong to the same natural group and that were endemic. So he knew that he was actually looking, I think it's like a controlled experiment. It doesn't make him a transmutationist, but I swear he must have been thinking sort of along these lines, because the patterns of replacements that interested him were not just this mollusk and that mollusk, it was these things that are unique to South America. And here he goes again. So I said, yeah, right there, that Cuvier and Lyell tend to say things would migrate in from elsewhere, and then Lyell also had this ecological notion. He got very excited about some small rodent bones that he found along with the larger fossil mammals, including ground sloths and so forth. I could perceive traces of 4 or 5 distinct animals, 2 of which certainly belong to the rodentia. One must have been allied to the agouti. Tarsi and metatarsi belong to an animal less than the present common inhabitant, Cavia patagonica. And then this little footnote, the agoutis are all proper to South America, and none have hitherto been found in a fossil state. He's very insistent that he's looking at things that are natural groups and are endemic to an area so that he can try to make some sense out of patterns of replacement and patterns of extinction later on and replacement by succeeding species. This is before he got Lyell. When I was sitting in the rare book room with Cohn, David he started saying, we got to read Lyell. We got to read Lyell. I said, well, we can read Lyell at any time, and we can buy him on Amazon, but here we are in the rare book room reading stuff that's otherwise unavailable. So let's just focus on that. He says, no, we have to read Lyell. And I said, well, why are you saying this? He said, well, he had Lyell on board with him, and we have to know what he was thinking based on that. And David was right because well, I was right too, because we could read Lyell. We actually basically read him later. But science is this sort of resonance between the natural world and what other people have already said and thought about their observations of that same natural world. And so these things are all sort of resonating inside the brain of a single person. But what other people have to say, particularly Darwin was very young and felt kind of, I think, insecure, rightly so, about what he was doing. So naturally he was going to be turning to other people like his old mentors, but also what was available as a publication too. He went on board, so David says, oh no, we're gonna read Lyell. We're gonna get Lyell, we have to get Lyell. So I said, all right. So he fills out a call slip for Lyell, and the 3 volumes of his Principles of Geology. And wouldn't you know it, a half an hour later, they bring out the 3 volumes that he had on the Beagle. The 3. I wouldn't touch them, David opened them up and said, oh, let's look at this, blah, blah, blah. First one says on the flyleaf, gift of Captain Fitzroy, written in pencil, and it was, that book had been published prior to the Beagle leaving London in latest December of 1831. He doesn't get the volume 2, which is Lyell's diatribe against Lamarck, until They get to Montevideo in November of 1832, so just about right after they leave it. So he doesn't get this focus from Lyell. In fact, Lyell doesn't even talk about natural groups, and he doesn't talk about endemism that much, and certainly not in the context of replacement. So I don't know where he got this, except for I don't think he invented it. I think there were other people, as I said, who were looking at natural groups and talking about natural groups. And I think some French botanists, I think the word endemism is from French botany. I'm not even quite sure. So he's not inventing these concepts, but he's restricting his gaze along these lines. And as I say, I have the sense, I don't know why he's doing it, but he's trying to control, almost in an experimental way, his observations so he can make some sort of sense about patterns of replacement in time and in space. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, yeah, he goes on about let's look at the other one now, the next slide. Oh, and he also had begun to see that not all species became extinct at the same time. He was very excited about this agouti, this cavy fossil, because it might not be the same species as the living one, it's less than it. It's very closely related. It's a much more interesting comparison, I think, to him than the glyptodont, which is in a vague sort of way is a giant armadillo, and the true armadillos. But he was really a bug about endemism. This is after he's home, so I'm skipping ahead. And this is actually a business card, and it's we found it in the library in his collections. So it's about the size of a business card. It's on cardboard, and the first side is the listing of the meetings for 1837 of the Zoological Society of London, as it says. And there's a green ink line under September 7th. So this is September 7th, 1837. This is undoubtedly the writing of George Waterhouse, who went on to describe the mammals of the Beagle. And obviously Darwin buttonholed this guy and said, give me a list of all the living species of xenarthrans, of edentates, because I should have said this, armadillos and sloths belong to this peculiar group called xenarthrans now, but they were edentates back then. And Waterhouse, very obligingly, gets browbeaten. I guess you could just see these guys. I got a pen. You got any paper? And so they finally come up with the back of the card, and Waterhouse writes down all the species right out of his head of the edentates of the world. And back then, they thought things like pangolin and duck-billed platypuses belonged in the group too. That's erroneous, but that's okay. That's what they thought. So Darwin basically got confirmed that almost all of the edentates, as they were understood back then, were South American. It's a very important point to him. Let's go to the next one. So I'm just saying this again. I'm just sort of summarizing. So he's only interested in spatiotemporal replacement patterns of allied forms and endemics. So he knows that the things didn't migrate in from someplace out. He doesn't say this anywhere. It's got to be the reason why he's focusing on it. And that last point there I've already made, which is that as hard as, not knowing the details of the systematics of the marine invertebrates, he wasn't really big. Or even the living insects and so forth that he was encountering and collecting. He couldn't basically, he couldn't rely on those replacement patterns because he didn't really know what he was looking at. Next slide, please. Bahia Blanca had a couple more wonderful things going for it. This is not obviously a fossil. This is Bothrops alternatus, and it's the fer-de-lance, the terciopelo up in Costa Rica area. Highly dangerous snake. Next slide. I also caught a large snake. This is that same letter to Henslow that he was talking to the fossils about. A large snake, which at the time I knew to be venomous, but now I find it equals in its poisonous qualities the rattlesnake. In its structure, it is very curious and marks the passage between the common venomous, meaning adders, and the rattlesnakes. Its tail is terminated by a hard oval point, in which I observe it vibrates as those possessed with a more perfect organ are known to do so. I mean, I started doing an informal poll when I stumbled on this quote after we got back from Cambridge. So I've known about it for a couple of years, and I read it over the phone to people, and they say, oh my God, he was an evolutionist in 1832. He really, I don't think, was. But this is the way people were talking. He would never have written Henslow that, because Henslow was a creationist, and he wouldn't want to upset Henslow. So this is just the way people thought, but he's very overt about it. It's not impossible, but it's not all that easy to find equally graphic things about anatomical transformations within allied groups. There's a good one from the fossil record that Martin Rudwick has involving, I think, Jurassic marine reptiles, which is kind of telling as well. But look at this, the word passage there. That gives you a sense of motion. This is what I mean. It's like proto-phylogenetics. This is people really, and transformation series without thinking about what the causal underpinnings of that might actually be. But that's really graphically, don't you think that's an amazing passage? And then he writes to Henslow, well, that's in his diary, and then he writes basically the same thing to Henslow. Let's take the next slide. And then he also talks, there was a system of systematics known as the Quinarian system, I think. But this guy Maclay had, and everything comes in fives and so forth. And the word in osculation, where things that look like they belong in one group, the circles would intersect and you get organisms with characteristics of two different groups. And so he found a bird there. He doesn't know whether it's, what does he say? It's a poor specimen, a happy mixture of a lark pigeon and a snipe. And I've been trying to find out if that bird specimen still exists. The snake, by the way, got lost. It never got described. It's in his zoology notes. It was sent to Berlin in the 1840s, and the herpetologist died before he had a chance to study the specimens. They're gone. But we don't know particularly about this, but he's talking about this combination of characteristics. And again, it's not necessarily transmutationist, but the picture I'm trying to paint for you, this is all at Bahia Blanca, all before he gets volume 2 of Lyle, his anti-evolution diatribe, is just rife with suggestive stuff about transmutation. He's right on the edge of this thing. And I don't even think it's like he can't even dare. I'm not even saying he's taken out his transmutationist deck of cards yet. I don't know. But it's just amazing how he's focusing on these endemic groups that are allied forms and looking at the transition in anatomical features between one group and another within allied groups. It's just amazing how sort of pre-adapted he was, I guess, to a transmutationist viewpoints. Let's leave it at that. Go to the next slide. All right, so he's not, well, all right, so I said all that. So we go on. He gets volume 2 of Lyle. It's suggested in the one I'm using, edited version of the 3 volumes of the Principles that you can buy for $12 on Amazon, that in the introduction there, the editor says that Lyle, when he wrote this, was up for a job as a geologist at King's College, presumably at Cambridge, and that one of the members of what we would call the search committee was the Archbishop up there, and had just written that geology was doing much now to undermine and threaten the integrity of the church in England. So there's a possible, it's a possibility that you can look at Lyle. Lyle was a lawyer. He was a great geologist, and as I say, he was also a great ecologist in my view. But he was a lawyer, and this is basically, volume 2 is a legal brief against transmutation, specifically against Lamarck. So there's a couple of points in there. Let me just say, yeah, he thinks that, and Darwin actually ends up agreeing with him, that on average, one species goes extinct every year through natural causes, and a new species is created every year, but not as a replacement, but in one ecosystem, like on the bottom of the ocean floor, something will go extinct, and a new species is created that same year, but on a mountaintop. It has nothing to do with one another. Let's see, and I said it's constrained ecologically, I already said that. He never mentions, except for once, allied forms. And I'll tell you about Brockie in a minute, because that's sort of a punchline. Let's go to the next slide. That's Sir Charles. Became a friend of Darwin's. He'd never accepted evolution until after the publication of On the Origin of Species. Very frustrating, but they were friendly nonetheless from the 1840s, 1844 or so, onwards, and they debated, and Lyle would come to his house and all that sort of a thing. And Darwin had enormous, as well as he should have, respect for Charles Lyell. And then the next slide Lyell's first page of volume 2 gives you 4 questions. The first is the most important. He says, we should inquire first whether species have a real and permanent existence in nature, or whether they are capable, as some naturalists pretend, of being indefinitely modified in the course of a long series of generations. I agree with David Cohn. Darwin's grandfather was important to him. Grant was important to him, but he really learned his transmutation from Lyell's discourse on Lamarck. Negative as it was fairly judicious summary of Lamarck's views. So he learns this, and I see that as basically as a litmus test. It helps me to understand what Darwin ended up doing for a lot of the rest of the trip, at least in South America. The next slide. Darwin started looking at patterns, and remember he says, patterns of replacement as you go south along the continent. That was point 2. The first was the fossil thing, which is Bahia Blanca, basically. Then he spends a lot of time going up and down the coast and going inland and looking at birds. And the easiest ones to observe are these rheas. And the greater rhea is up in southern Brazil and goes down to Rio Negro in Patagonia. I don't have a map of that right now. And it meets at the Rio Negro, but they do not inosculate. They do not sort of blend into each other. The slightly smaller, browner species with bluer eggs and a slightly different behavior and so forth. Species of rhea that was called Darwin's rhea. There's lots of stories about that, but time, I guess, is constraining us. That thing goes all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, the one on the left, and then swings back up the Andes a little bit. And we're hoping to see them when we go down to Patagonia in a couple of months. And this basically, I gotta tell you that we had these 2 things in the exhibition. And every time we put on another version of the exhibition, you can't always get specimens of these things, but they are so important. You know, when I grew up learning, well, when I went to college and I took my first paleo course, we had Moore, Lalacher, and Fisher, and I should have brought that slide, as our textbook. Early 50s textbook. This was like 10 years later or whatever when I was taking this course. And there was what I call the rabbit ear antenna. It's going to go extinct pretty soon because of the new digital laws. But anyway, this was the model of evolution that I learned from that textbook, that you have an ancestral species and the things diverge like this. So it's the rabbit ear model of evolution. That was based on Darwin's later, not his initial thinking, on these 2 rheas, because he has them replacing each other geographically, and as soon as he comes really out into the open and admits that he's a transmutationist, he's trying to figure out what the pattern of evolution must have been. A derivation from a common ancestor like this was the final solution he came up with. But earlier, he had a much more sort of abrupt, sort of a punctuated equilibria, dare I say it, model for the evolution of these birds. Well, the next slide. Yeah, I already mentioned Maldonado, where he shoots all these birds. So he's going up and down. So he's got a big collection of birds now. So if you read his zoology notes, we're out of his geology notes for the moment. You read his zoology notes, he's saying, is this the same? This is not the same version of, for instance, the Furnariids, the oven birds. They're good because the birds about this big or sometimes a little bit bigger, and they're on the ground, and very often they're in the open, so even a person like myself could see them. And so they would shoot these things and look at them, and it's a little bit different here than it was over there. He starts to make these sorts of comparisons that he was in fact doing with botanical specimens back in England, but he's doing them on a more or less systematic basis while he's on the ship. And he's beginning to understand that when he's first doing birds, he's slapping European names on them, which is what people do. But then he realizes that a lot of these birds are endemic to South America. He gets much more interested in them. For instance, the Funariids. So his notes are full of, this takes the place of that as you go southward, or you're in this place and that place. It's not the same, it's a different species. I don't know if it's a variety or a species, he says. Next slide. Goes to the Falkland Islands twice. I already mentioned that. The second time he's there, he's talking to people. He was really good. Even later in life, he would ask his barber about dog breeds. He asked anybody who seemed to know anything about any subject that was pertinent to his work. He would ask them and get their opinion. So gauchos and Indians, he's asking all, and he found out about that lesser rare, actually, from talking to gauchos and Indians. And he says, so these wolf foxes, common to both islands, gauchos and Indians from nearly all parts of South America have been here, and nearly all say it is not found on the continent, an indisputable proof of its individuality as a species. And I marked that word individuality. He's seeing species as individuals already, and we'll get to the reason for that in a moment, the intellectual reason. And then he sees, or at least he claims he sees, what a whaler told him, which is that the foxes are different on the two different islands. Out of the 4 specimens of foxes on board, the 3 are darker and come from the east. There is a smaller and rusty-colored one, which comes from the West Island. It's actually an observation that was disputed. He predicted that the fox would go extinct because he collected the 4 specimens with his geological hammer. He just walked up to them and did that, which is kind of appalling. There's geology again for you, though. And he says, I'm afraid these foxes are not long for this world. And they are gone. They're extinct. And it's been disputed that there actually was this variation from island to island. But Galapagos was not the first place that he was starting to make these observations. So you got patterns of replacement down the continent, that on the islands that you visit, and the Falklands were the main ones in the Atlantic, but there were other island groups in the Pacific. They have South American character to the fauna, but they're different, and they're different species. And if you have an archipelago situation, you tend to get slight differences from place to place. It wasn't the Galapagos that he first saw that. It was in the Falkland Islands that he saw that. So, all right, so this is his work going on. He's seeing a lot more fossils, but he can't do much with them. The Falklands have great Devonian fossils there, trilobites and brachiopods and so forth. He saw them, but they were basically curiosities. He collected them. We put some on display. But again, it's the Paleozoic. What he was really looking at was the relationship of the modern fauna. It's like Steve Gould's PhD thesis in Bermuda, where he's looking at the fossil lineages leading up to the modern, and some of the things are extinct, but the modern fauna has living representatives. So he called that a microcosm in Bermuda. And that's what Darwin had the fortunate, he was fortunate enough to actually stumble on that. So a Paleozoic fossil to Darwin by this time was basically a curiosity, and only that. And his Mesozoic ammonites in the Andes later on too. Next slide. He has 2 essays in the earthquake portfolio at Cambridge. How am I doing? Oh, out of time. Jeez. He's looking at Lyell. He cannot for the life of him understand how large mammals can be supported in such a scrubby wasteland as Patagonia. And yet there are the camel, what are they? And the reyes and so on and so forth. And he thinks he's doing some paleoecology. He thinks that the sediments show that it was very dry back then when the glyptodonts and the giant ground sloths were also still in existence. Can I go on for a little bit more? I'm not. Yes, I get loaded up and I just keep going, you know. And I haven't even had a drink yet today. I mean, this is ridiculous. But this stuff, I'm still trying to figure this stuff out. You know, it's why he's doing what he's doing. So anyway, so he writes in Reflections on My Geological Notes. He sort of writes a general theory of the deposition and the sequence and the terracing, uplifts and so forth, along the southern Atlantic coast of South America. But he's also saying that, as far as he can tell, there was no environmental change for the extinction of those large mammals. So that's kind of important, because Lyell says that God is causing extinctions as well as creation of species, but actually there are secondary causes that you can point to for the extinctions of any individual species, and they're all environmental, which is what I basically feel too, and these days. And so I think Lyell was basically right, but Darwin says, no, not really. So the next slide. Now here's something that's contentious. It's only been published once by a historian named Michael Hodge in 1982 or 3. It's an essay called February 1835. In 1835, so it's the other essay. It's a very short little thing. It's hard to interpret this essay. People do argue about it, but he goes back to a lot of these themes that we see snippets of in his early notes. And Mike Hodge says, is it evolutionary? I don't know, you know, and sometimes I wake up and I think it is, and sometimes, like this morning, I wake up and I think maybe David Cohen is right and I'm wrong. I mean, I'm really, I'm still trying to figure this out. But I think what we really have to look at was this guy, Giovanni Battista Brocchi, who was a geologist and paleontologist in Italy. And Lyle was, according to Martin Rudwick, fluent in Italian. And he went there, and his equivalent of the Beagle journey was to go to Italy. And amongst the people that he met there was this guy, Brocchi. He was a geologist, paleontologist. And Brocchi, and you can read about this in Rudwick's latest book. I mean, I found this stuff out a couple of years ago, but now I'm very happy to get some corroboration from Martin. Martin doesn't know the connection. This is all unpublished stuff. But Martin doesn't know the connection with Darwin or this, but he says that Lyle got the expression, the births and deaths of species. I thought maybe that was another thing that was just in the air. It really wasn't. He got it from Brocchi. Brocchi said there are births and deaths of species, and he had this notion that Lyle very carefully recounts in the Principles and rejects, with the greatest deal of respect, what Brocchi says. But Brocchi says, I think that species have internal longevities to them. And so some species last longer than others. And extinction is not a matter of an environmental event or any other kind of sort of physical cause. It's basically running out of gas. And the evidence for that, and that would be in the next slide, is this argument about grafting of apple trees. And he says that thousands of trees are subject to the duration of life which one bud contained. So Darwin says that basically we would say now the genetics, if you graft something on and keep grafting, you're going to get this genetically identical stuff, and they're all going to have the same characteristic lifespan measured in terms of productive fruiting of a tree. And Brocchi says that means, he sees an analogy. Basically what he's saying is that there's the life and death of species has natural causes, and it can be understood analogous to the life and death of individuals, organisms. And, you know, it's really great because in the 80s we spent a lot of time saying, aha, you know, species are like individuals. You know, they have births, they have histories, they have deaths. And we came at that from an evolutionary perspective. What I'm saying is that Darwin's transmutational ideas basically come out of his accepting Brocchi's ideas, because he cannot see any physical reason for extinction there. So he accepts Brocchi's ideas and how they fit in. So patterns, and what he's ending up doing here, he says, for a while, I mean, you can actually say, I cannot see such difficulty in believing a similar duration might be propagated with true generation. For a while, I was toying with the idea that this is a violation, basically. It's a heretical violation of that quote of Lyle, that species have properties and they don't change through time. And I think that Darwin actually might be hinting that the longevities of species can change through time. Be that as it may, he says, if the existence, he scratched out gradual deaths, if the existence of species allowed each according to its kind, meaning each one with its own intrinsic probability of survival, or its blueprint for survival, internalized, we must suppose deaths to follow. I was telling Carl about this just before we started, to follow at different epochs, at different epochs, and then successive births must repeople the globe, or the number of its inhabitants has varied exceedingly at different periods. In other words, standing crop of biodiversity is going to be all over the place unless you have a regular replacement going on. And obviously it's constrained by that, the other slide had it, by endemic groups. You're talking about endemic natural kind groups, patterns of replacement, and you get repeopling in the next epoch by something in that same group that had been there before, or that would be, or if that weren't going on, it's a theoretical argument, the number of inhabitants varied exceedingly at different periods. Biodiversity would be all over the place, standing crop, and he was assuming that it was basically in equilibrium. A supposition in contradiction to the fitness which the author of nature, which means God, that I don't think we have to take too seriously, has now established, Lyle uses the phrase all the time. In other words, we know that there's a pretty much of an equilibrium of biodiversity out there. So if you're going to drop things out, and they drop out at different times, each according to the intrinsic sort of lifespan that's built into each species, then pretty soon within that group you've got to get that replacement. It's a very different kind of an argument. It's like this and this. And as I said to Carl, it's not the turnover pulses, coordinated stasis, whatever you want to call them, because he sees them staggered. The gradual births and deaths, he doesn't mean gradual in the sense that we would use it. It means they're staggered. They're not all concentrated at horizons the way lots of us think they actually are. So anyway, I don't know how clear this is. I woke up debating this in my mind this morning. That's just, how tough it is. As I say, Hodge doesn't, it's got a smell of transmutation about it, but it's really hard to ferret it out. Sandy Herbert wrote a great book about Darwin, the geologist, all about his work on the Beagle, and she points out that the captain had the absolute right to inspect any writings on that ship. And Darwin had a later history of being very coy. He didn't show anybody anything. He didn't publish for years anyway. I think it was a habit he started on the Beagle. He didn't want, the captain actually asked to see his diary early in the, said, hey, this is good stuff, you ought to publish it sometime, But the captain was a very religious and anti-transmutation and everything. So I think he's being cryptic here. You can't prove it, but I think by 1835 February, he was definitely, let us just say, he had that transmutational deck of cards out. Let's go to the next slide. That just shows that we read it, so go to the next one. All right, it's brokey, but go on to the next one. The analogy is the key thing. The life and death of individuals and the life and death of species are analogous, and there are natural causes for all. And, then he stops in Cape Town. I'm skipping the Galapagos just for a moment, and maybe we better stop because I'm way over time. But this is what Herschel wrote Lyle in 1836, a year later, that he believed the births of species would eventually be shown to be the product of intermediate causes just like everything else in nature. That's the mystery of mysteries, So this was in the air. People were supposed to be looking for this. And actually Herschel told Lyle later in that same letter that Lyle had prevaricated and dodged the whole issue in volume 2. It was very caustic and, very critical of it. And I think Darwin was actually on to doing precisely that even then. And the next slide, this really lets the cat out of the bag. And I have things to say about the Galapagos. I have things to say. Well, yeah, I can go on and on. I think maybe we should just stop right here just to try to digest what we've done. But David Cohn found this letter a year ago. And it's never been, it's been published, but no, it's not. The significance of it is just not understood. Leonard Jennings was the brother-in-law of Henslow. He was also a reverend. And he was asked before Darwin, a number of people were, Henslow and Jennings were two of them, to go on the Beagle, and they all turned them down, turned down the Admiralty. So that's how Darwin ended up getting the gig. So he's writing to Jennings, and what Jennings wrote him to prompt this response is not known. We don't know. That letter is lost, if there indeed was one. But he says, with respect to my far distant work on species, and sure, it was another 15 years before he published, I must have expressed myself with singular inaccuracy if I led you to suppose that I meant to say that my conclusions were inevitable. They have become so after years of weighing puzzles to myself alone, but in my wildest dream I never expect, and this is my emphasis, more than to be able to show that there are two sides to the question. This is the two decks of the immutability of species, i.e. whether species are directly created or by intermediate laws, as with the life and death of individuals. I did not approach the subject on the side of the difficulty of determining what are species and what are varieties. I think he sort of did, actually. But though and why I should give you such a history of my doings, it would be hard to say. From such facts as the relationship between the living and extinct mammifers in South America and between those living on the continent and on adjoining islands such as the Galapagos. So it was this notion that it's the job of a scientist to come up with secondary causes. This was in the air. People were saying that. for all problems, not just the extinction of species, but also the creation of species. But this life and death of species rhetoric that Lyell introduced to Darwin came from this Italian geologist Brocchi, who actually had his own theory about this, about the internalized thing. And he made this direct analogy between the life and death of individuals. I mean, no matter how much, what that says is that no matter how much one might believe that God knows that, not only knows that you're alive, but had everything to do with your appearing on earth, and is cognizant and maybe has to do with your actual death, nonetheless, there were sufficient natural laws, even back then, to explain the birth and deaths of organisms. And the deaths of species were already explained naturalistically, even though Lyell didn't agree with Darwin or vice versa on how that actually happened. But the people were content to have natural law explanations. Why not for species? It's still, Darwin is cryptic. You cannot, he left so much written, but you still can't really pull it apart and say, aha, this is when he started thinking about transmutation. In a sense, he was thinking about it all along. In another sense, he's very coy and cryptic about expressing himself. We do know, and that's another story, that by the end of the Beagle voyage, he actually does say, you know, these facts on the archipelagos undermine the stability of species. So we know that he actually was a transmutationist by the time he got back. I hope you can see how important fossils were to him. Later on, they became an embarrassment to him because the theory that he adopted, the fossil record, didn't seem to actually fit it. And we know all about that. We've been fighting this for a long time. It's one of the reasons why paleontology lost its sort of place in the biological sciences. It's ridiculous that this has happened. It need not have happened. But without the fossil record, Darwin wouldn't have gotten there in the first place. And now I'll let you go. Thank you.